Good afternoon or evening, as the case may be. Welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives with me, Chris Eyre, and Elgin Hutchback. Joining us are Henry Neufeld and the Reverend Steve Kimball. We have a number of items, and first is an extra item on which there is actually something in the showcase. On polls, Henry, you brought this up.
Okay, well, I'm going to work with a few minutes talking about polls and how to interpret them. And hold on a second, I'm going to use a slideshow. This is something we haven't done, I think, on Global Christian Perspectives, so be reasonably patient as we do it. See if we've got it. It says I'm screen sharing, but I don't see it on my screen. Are you by any chance selected there, or does it show up on the screen at this point for other people?
I see it.
I see it too.
Okay, I can't see it from here, but that's okay. The first slide isn't that important. At least those of us who are over here in the States are going to discuss a little bit about how things are going to go in the election. And I think that probably a key is that just about any time you see a number in the news, it's misused. I mean, it's really, I think, quite badly done. So I'm going to give a quick thing on polls. And this is particularly so that Elgin can argue with me later. So we're going to talk a little bit about polls and predictions because those are applying are being used right now in a huge number of stories. Let's go on here to the next slide, if I can make my computer do that. There we go. It went and did too. There we go. I think that the general image that people have of polling is something like polling your high school class for the class president election. You take a percentage of the class and get yourself a sample. You know everyone. You ask a few people. You work it out to the results. The vote takes place at one time. You don't have a lot of delay. You don't have a lot of people who don't show up to vote. The error is how much different that is from the actual vote for class president. Interestingly enough, if you, on the size of just about anybody's high school class, if you were to check the sample for statistical error, your statistical error would be enormous on that size of a sample. But I think people take this particular image to the poll, which is not really how they work. And as I go on here, I'm using a sample, but I will use several links. I put in the showcase a little post abusing polls, which is largely educational sources on how polls are done. So if you go to the showcase, it should be on the right-hand side. If you're on Google+, you'll be able to get those links. I've put together here just a little bit a sample showing margin of error, and this is one of the things that is commonly misreported, even though reporters are educated on it. I put together just a fake set of data, you know, candidate one with a plus or minus 3% margin of error. So you have 32, 35, 38, and you can see the polls here so that you can see, for example, if your second candidate has his higher number, he would win over number one in both of the cases, both the lowest and in the center point, the point reported by the poll. Margin of error is often misreported in the news in the sense that you say there's been a shift in momentum when the shift falls within the margin of error. And statisticians will tell you that they actually require approximately half of that margin of error between the low and the high before they start regarding it as significant. Margin of error is really being used as shorthand for sampling error. There are several other errors that could be taking place and that have taken place recently. Let me give you a couple of links here. These are also in that post that I put in the showcase. The Roper Center at Cornell, Polling Fundamentals, talks about the total survey error. This is all the different errors that contribute overall to the error of sampling. And then the second link there, Langer Research, is a calculator where if you have the numbers, you can just take a look. It's very educational to just grab a few numbers, poke them in there, and see how various things impact a poll. I understand that this may be a little bit complex for a lot of people watching politics, but you're open up to being misled intentionally or unintentionally if you don't follow this sort of thing. One of the key differences between your favorite high school class is weighting. That's dividing up by demographics. For example, I show here, like if you looking at how many people 18 to 29 are included, and so what you do is you weight each of these groups. Well, that weighting is according to how you expect these people to vote, how many of them will be in the population that actually votes. Let's consider one change in the election. At the last minute in Ohio, 17-year-olds who would be 18 by the general election were allowed to vote in the primary. Nobody knew how to factor that into the results. Division by race. How are people going to vote? And this error applies to each one of these numbers separately. One of the calculations that the links will provide is how you can calculate a potential weighting error. Party likelihood to vote. Likelihood to vote has been one of the keys that has made a problem for polls. You'll see, especially in the fall, likely voters versus registered voters, and the results will change according to which group is being polled. So all of those things have to be watched. And the calculation of your weighted samples makes a huge difference. So on a site like 538.com, Nate Silver's site, tracks the accuracy of various polls compared to the results, and there is quite a difference between the various polling institutions, and this is where it would come in. Let me just give here, this year, the best example of polling error was the Bernie Sanders victory in Michigan when he was predicted to lose by double digits. Possibly the largest polling upset in primary history. And I take this quote here where this Mitchell Research and Communications, they showed 37% percentage point Clinton lead in a poll. It's conducted on Sunday for an election on Tuesday. They found that people younger than 50 would make up less than a quarter of all voters, and those voters made up more than half. Because of that difference in the demographics of who voted versus who the pollsters predicted would vote, made a huge difference in the result, and you can see the link there below. One of the things I like about 538.com is when they're wrong, you can count on them for a long article saying why we were wrong, and they'll show you all of the various things that were wrong in their calculations ahead of time. So there's the link. That's also included in that showcase post. Now, psychological factors are important, and I'm almost done, guys. Psychological factors are important. If I'm showing a close election here, let's say you have 50.5 versus 49.5. If it's the election, 50.5 is the winner, 49.5 is the loser. But as you can see from the chart, if it's a poll, these are really not, there isn't a significant difference. Psychologically, however, and also by the way headlines are reported, you very often see 50.5 versus 49.5 as a slight lead, even though even at a fairly large sample size, your error is going to be, say, 3% at about 1,000 plus sample size. And so I did it here as 1,000 plus sample size. Note that most of our primary polling doesn't have that large of a sample size, and therefore the error range is even larger. But the psychology is that whichever one comes out on top, however statistically significant, feels like the victory, gets reported like a victory. We have momentum, we have narrative, we have all this stuff. And so I go here in the news, watching headlines versus content. I don't know how many times we say so-and-so has a substantial lead in the poll, and when I factor in the margin for error, it really is very marginally statistically significant. The data versus the analysis that reporters are making. I've seen some articles this year where you have 90% analysis of tiny quantities of data. We have bias, we have wishful thinking, where somebody looks at it and tries to see the poll as favorable as possible. That's like the 3% plus 3% minus margin of error is noticed in favor of your candidate and the minus in opposition to the other guy. Novelty, I think, has come up this year. I think that the media really likes having Donald Trump leading, and so they find ways to make it sound like he's actually doing better than he really is in any particular election. Of course, the construction of the poll, which is rarely in the articles that you read, but you can go back to the sites of the polling organizations and find out. The narrative, which is, of course, built up out of all of this, and the expectations game is psychology. What did we expect? What did we get? When the expectation can be completely unreal, made up of nothing, and then when it's either beat or missed, it's major news. So we have unnews creates news that way. And that's it. I just wanted to bring up those things. Probably most people who would watch this know them anyway, but there we go. I'm going to close the presentation. Chris, back to you.
So, fundamentally, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics, as Churchill put it.
Pretty much.
And slightly beyond that, there's meta-statistical analysis.
Meta-lies?
Meta-statistical analysis, you sum the results of various polls. Yes. I'm kind of well acquainted with errors, being a scientist on the side, and the horrifying thing is when small errors multiply, because you've got an error here, an error there, and you get a multiplicative effect, which can be quite alarming on your accuracy. And I think the pollsters are discovering that.
I should add one thing that I forgot to mention, speaking about meta-analysis. Like 538.com that I cited is a meta-analysis site. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they do, even though they explain it 50 times all over their website, that is commonly misunderstood, is stating that their average of polls doesn't have a margin of error. And the fact is, it is true, it doesn't have a margin of error because it is not possible to calculate one for an average of polls. Now, they explain quite correctly that that doesn't mean that there's no error in the average of polls. What it means is that there is no statistically calculable margin of error because you don't have the right data to combine.
Hey ho. Has anybody else any comments on that before we move on to the predictions item, which might be rather moot after that?
I would agree with that. The only thing I would add is pollsters are having an increased problem in the sense that people are becoming less and less likely to even answer a poll. So they're self-selecting themselves out of the poll. And then you add into the fact that sometimes people lie to pollsters. That it makes the polls extremely difficult to calculate, and we've seen some pretty significant errors in recent years. In fact, we've seen more errors than we've seen accuracies.
And with the reduction of landlines and the movement to cell phones, especially for the younger people, makes it almost impossible to have the percentage of accuracy that obtained before that. Henry, I'm wondering if you have anything to say about push polls.
Well, push polls are not an issue of statistics. Push polls are an issue of polling methodology. Anything that you have where you get an error from construction of the polling question, and that would apply to a push poll, which is where you're attempting, for anybody that doesn't know what a push poll is, which I'm sure the four of us do, but if you haven't been subject to one, it's more or less, are you going to vote for my righteous candidate who is singing with the angelic choirs, or for his demonic opponent with the flames of hell licking around his feet? That's probably a crude example, but some of them aren't much. They aren't far from that. And the thing is, the statistics can't measure for that particular kind of error, because that creates, you're talking psychology. It's, when they say, and that's the problem with the term margin of error, is margin of error makes people think the poll is going to be within 3 points of this. That's not what that means. That's a statistical statement regarding the sample size and the nature of the sampling process, and so a poll design, especially an intentional design to drive the poll numbers, ruins that. And on the point of the cell phones, I'm told that almost all pollsters now are using a cell phone sample, but the response rate is down to something like 10%. Response rate makes it problematic to get a truly random sample, which again throws more weight onto the weighted demographics. And then you can get this, like, well, that one that I cited, which is 37-point lead for Clinton, which resulted in a 1-point lead for Sanders. That's a 38%. That's you're 38 points off, and that was only one factor, but one of the factors was way underestimating the participation of younger voters in that particular election. And that's, I just use that because it's the largest one, but there's numerous other smaller errors that result from the same issue.
Okay, well, from that point, who do we expect to be fighting who in the actual election at this point?
Couldn't quite understand that. What was the question again?
Do we think there's any chance that it won't be Trump versus Clinton in the election?
Yes. I don't think it will be.
Well, actually, in this case, I don't.
Go ahead, Henry.
I'll just go ahead. I think that there is a significant chance that it won't be Trump versus Clinton in the election. And the fact is that the statistics very strongly, right now, it makes it quite doubtful that Trump can get the actual majority of the delegates. And I'm talking about looking at both existing polls, which are very thin on the ground, and also the demographics of the upcoming races. He has to do extremely well, and it's almost impossible that he would get them before the final day. In other words, before June 7th. June 7th is going to be iffy. I don't, I don't think I wouldn't go with Elgin that I think it's not going to be, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, and I think the differences are going to be psychology and the party leadership is, some people are turning to Trump that I think are surprising to me, and that leaves me doubtful as to, there may be more people who decide we can put up with him than I would have expected, because I've already seen that. I would not have expected I would not have expected Ben Carson to endorse him, for example. I was surprised by Chris Christie, but only mildly. I was shocked by Ben Carson, and that makes me wonder how solid the wall is amongst what I would call sincere conservatives, because I really don't think that Trump is a conservative choice, in my view.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Trump is a Trump choice. But I think in terms of, I agree Trump's got a chance at this. I think I wouldn't by any means rule him out. But looking at the past elections, there's a couple of factors for me is that he's not been able to break 50%. In most of the elections, he's down around the 30s. In most of the elections, the Rubio-Cruz vote combined will exceed Trump's vote. The other thing that's important for me is that if you look at the primaries we've had so far, we had two types here. One are open and closed. In a closed primary, only Republicans can vote for the Republican nominee. In an open primary, anybody can vote for the Republican nominee. And in the closed primaries, Trump's lost most of those so far. And coming up, we've got 9 primaries that are closed. We've got 4 primaries where only Republicans independents can vote. And then there's 4 that are completely open. So I think Cruz has got an advantage there. The other thing is that California is going to be a strange animal this year. Well, it's always strange, but it's going to have 53 individual elections, or actually you could consider it 54, for delegates. And Cruz has known that for a long time. The guy who wrote the rules back in 2000 is on his campaign, so they've been planning for this a long time. No other candidate has yet seemed to put the ground game in California to take advantage or to deal with that unusual situation. And so I think Cruz has got an advantage there. So I think when you add all that up, the fact that I think the majority of the other candidates, people who have dropped out, will coalesce around Cruz now, because Kasich doesn't really have a chance to block Trump. He can only act as a spoiler. I think Cruz has got an edge going into the rest of the nominations. I still don't. My guess is he won't get the majority going into the primary or going into the convention. Although that's still a possibility for him. But I think once the convention starts, I don't see the convention with all the forces arrayed against Trump, particularly within the party level, since he's lost the majority of the Republican-only primaries. I just don't see them nominating Trump.
I'd like to hit you with 2 things, of course. One is, for some people, including me, who used to be a Republican and am now registered as independent, if I was still a Republican, I don't find Cruz that much more, how shall I say, acceptable than Trump, even though for very different reasons. I disagree with Cruz on policy reasons. I don't consider him unreliable, stupid, or unqualified, which is a different kind of a view. But the second thing is, the first, how shall I say, a more recent poll of New York came in, or post-Rubio's dropout, and Trump jumped to 64% to 12% for Cruz in New York, and that's going to be. That poll is, and of course, one poll, and for all the reasons I've just been saying, doesn't tell us the answer, but it surprises me because of what you were already saying about the ceiling, which I would think amongst Republicans, even in New York State or New Jersey, that a certain amount of a ceiling would apply there. So that was kind of, we need to watch for that as we go forward.
Yeah, I expect Trump to do well in certain states. If I was to pick a state where he would do well, it would be a state like New York. As Cruz got in trouble for pointing out, but Trump himself had pointed out earlier, he has New York values. So that's going to be, that's like Kasich in Ohio. Kasich can do well in one state, and I don't rule out Trump going ahead. I just think if I had to put money on it at this point, since it's unlikely he'll get the delegates before the convention, I have a hard time seeing him get nominated at the convention.
Oh, and I agree with you on that. If he doesn't have the delegates going in, I find it hard to believe that he would get it.
And the most likely person out there, in fact, really much the only person at this point, is Cruz. So it's a lot of Republicans who don't like Cruz are going to come down to, who do they like better, Cruz or Trump? And I think there is some opening for establishment Republicans to center around Trump. So,
well, and some of them will do like I did and register independent.
But they won't be going to the convention.
This is true.
Okay, so I take it that everybody's agreed that it won't be Sanders on the Democratic side.
Yes.
I
haven't changed my
some
opinion.
things. Yeah, all things may be possible, but some things are a lot less possible than others, and Sanders winning the nomination is just, no, I don't think it's going to happen.
Okay.
I'm not sure it's going to be Clinton, but I'm sure it's not going to be Sanders.
And Elgin and I have already argued over that one before, so
Okay.
we won't do it again.
On the other hand, it's turning out that Sanders is the big winner because he's moved Hillary dramatically to the left and taking up much of his own positions as her own. And for Sanders supporters, as I am, I find that very agreeable if he can't make it all the way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wish that he could move Hillary Clinton to the left on foreign policy a bit.
Yes, indeed.
But I don't see it.
I couldn't agree more. The one thing that could hurt her in the election is her neocon almost approach to foreign policy, where regime change is part of her package, and that's been devastating and especially hurtful for her future.
And the fact that she's just a bad candidate.
Well, I don't know that any Democrat's going to beat her, bad candidate or not. It's not in the cards. The Republican Party is just in turmoil. It will be in turmoil after the convention. So many people are going to drop out from bothering to vote that I think she's a shoo-in.
Assuming she doesn't get indicted.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Elgin and I have had that discussion too. So
we have, I find, reached our halfway point on basically politics. Halfway, generally, we take the opportunity to introduce ourselves and anything we may have written. There are four of us, so I'll assume that anybody watching already knows me. Would anybody else like to chip in and push books at this point?
Would we like to come in and what?
Push our own books. I suspect that you might like to.
I still didn't get that. I'm sorry.
He's asking if you want to push your books. You ought to say something nice about your books. Wave the cover in front of people. I've never seen a group of authors so unanxious to sell their books.
Nicely said as the publisher. Well, I'm Elgin Hushbeck. I've written 4 books and Henry's been gracious enough to publish them. And I also write a twice-a-month column for the Energeon Discussion Network. So,
Steve?
Well, here's my book. I'm right and you're wrong, and it's not about politics, but it could be, because what we look at is how our a prioris, how our predispositions determine the outcome of our thinking, especially when we bring it to the Bible, but you can transfer this easily to politics as well. We all carry certain assumptions about the way the world works. And like, for instance, if you believe that capitalism is the greatest economic system sent directly from heaven, you're probably going to vote Republican. If you don't think so, you may have other options. So my book really helps us understand how these things that we bring to the Bible create the interpretations we take from the Bible. I'm right and you're wrong.
Thank you, Steve. I think it's also worth mentioning that that you're the man who brings the Energeon Discussion Network together, for which many thanks.
Well, fortunately, being the editor is a joy, because I get such great cooperation from all of you in helping me make it easy by making your deadlines and providing really good material. So without that, I don't know if I could be doing it with such great cooperation.
Splendid. Moving on, and actually sticking with the topic of politics, there was a recent post on the discussion network from Alan, who unfortunately can't be with us, Alan Bevere, discussing whether a Christian politician can campaign as a Christian. Now, Steve, I believe you wrote something in support of that. Perhaps you could...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my concern really is, I'd like to ask Elgin, for instance. You know the lay of the land between now and the conventions for the Republican Party. You may even know a little bit more about the Democratic situation as it unfolds. I mean, you're on top of this. You have been on top of this. And you are very committed to an outcome. I want to know why. Why do you care what goes on in the political world?
Because the political world shapes the world in which we live in, and the laws. There's a difference. Why is it better to live in the United States than in Zimbabwe? And I would argue it's not the land. It's not even the people themselves. It's the governments they have. And government, as we've seen in the 20th century, government has been the greatest force for evil that we've ever seen. Now, I also think it can be a great source for good. I would not say the greatest source for good, but it can be a great source for good. In terms of human organizations, the propensity for a government to free people and allow them to become the most they can be, allow them to have the infrastructure where they can lead happy, profitable lives, I think is great. On the other hand, the propensity for causing tremendous suffering by people, even to the point of countries going to war with other countries, is great. You mentioned foreign policy in terms of the candidates. Now, the person who's the president of the United States has great say as to what will happen, and through their action or inaction can get us into war. I think both are possible. I think action can get us into war, and inaction can get us into war. And so for us as Christians to say we're concerned about people, but we don't care what governments will do to us or what evils that they will bestow or good that they will provide, I think is just to me a little bit strange.
Okay, well, I certainly appreciate what you're saying and agree with much of it. My concern, especially, now I won't make this about you, but I will certainly make it about the hard Christian right. When you listen to their radio programs, it's like the future of America is at stake in the sense that if we don't elect the right person, we are bound for misery and grief for the next 4 to 8 years. To me,
I would agree with that, by the way. But
okay.
not for 8 years. I would say the country's gone.
Well, okay. See now, so the fate of our country in that scenario is a political fate. When as I read the Bible, I see the issue not being political in the sense of what you're talking about, but rather providing an alternative to the way the world works, which is what Jesus did when he inaugurated the kingdom of God as a kingdom of...
I think did we lose Steve?
I think we've lost Steve.
Hopefully he'll come back. Let me address what he was saying. Yes, I believe that the fate of the country is in peril, because the country was founded on certain provisions, and I don't believe the Democratic Party supports those provisions any longer. And they'll change the country in ways that I think will be detrimental to the country. Now, it's not because I'm, American in the sense that I want, America to survive is the reason I'm concerned. I'm concerned because I think that'll ultimately be harmful to the people in the country. I think that, if we continue, for example, we continue to rack up the debt that we're currently racking up, at some point that bill is going to come due, and when it does, people will suffer. And so I believe we need to address that. I believe the Constitution was important. If liberal justices who believe the Constitution is a living document to evolve as they see fit evolving it, then I think that's detrimental to the country as a whole, and I think that will harm people's lives. So it's I happen to believe that America is one of the best countries, or the best country ever founded. It provides the most freedom. It provides the most economic growth. It's actually one of the things I'm writing on for the next post. So it's not because my country right or wrong. Our country, America's done some pretty horrible things in times, but I think overall, in terms of the amount of freedom and the amount of comfort that it has provided people, it's leading the world, and that's why I'm concerned about its outcome and where it goes.
What actually concerned me about the direction of Alan's post was that it very much struck me as coming from the point of view of politics is an incredibly dirty game, and Christians cannot possibly sully themselves with it. And to an extent, it seemed to me, if you cannot be perfect in politics, in political terms, you are compromising yourself. Now, I have roughly the same attitude to politics as you do, Elgin, but from a diametrically opposed social policy point of view. From my point of view, I think that in order for evil to triumph, it is only necessary that good men do nothing. And from my point of view, the good men who are not doing nearly enough in this respect are social gospel Christians. Our country at the moment is moving hugely towards the right, with massively less concern for the underprivileged in society, and it is wrecking our society. And just like you, I think it is absolutely vital that that be stopped. I think it may already be too late in our case. I don't know whether the current extra round of austerity measures hitting the poor in society are actually going to push the population to a breaking point, but I fear they won't. So I think it's absolutely vital that Christians involve themselves in politics, because if they don't, worse people will involve themselves.
Exactly. I do question, Alan, the perception that it's too dirty of a game, and because I've been involved with people who are not in that world. And by the way, I believe that there are good people on both sides of the political spectrum. I believe there are good Democrats and good Republicans. I actually think Sanders, even though I think Clinton is a crook and thoroughly corrupt, I don't think that of Sanders at all. I don't think that of Obama. I don't look at the other side and immediately assume that they're corrupt, and I think I resist that entire line of thinking. I think it's one of the reasons we have Trump, because I see a lot of the people who are supporting Trump are taking the attitude of, well, they're all crooks and Trump's going to clean it out. And I've seen that attitude for a long time, throughout most of my life, in fact, and I've always resisted the idea that they're all crooks. And I think that's one of the things that Trump is tapping into, that idea that, throw them all out and just go with somebody who's going to shake. I think a lot of Trump is they just want the place shook up. They don't really care how it gets shook up, and I think that's very dangerous.
Let me jump in here for just a second. Steve had just called me, and he's out of here completely, to the extent of taking his computer to the shop.
So he wasn't struck by lightning?
I don't know. I don't know what exactly happened, but he's having to go and get it repaired. I do want to comment. We have great sympathy with Steve on that, but I do want to comment, and in some ways support part of his position there. What I find odd with Christians is the level of investment. And I guess part of that, and one of the things I might have said earlier when I was talking about bias, we talk about right and left-wing bias, and then somebody assumes that perhaps a moderate like me, that I think that I don't have a bias, but of course I have biases just like everybody else. It's just differently positioned on the spectrum. And I honestly don't feel like that's the end of America with either direction. And I find it odd that Christians are so invested in the political process, and I don't, by that I don't mean not involved. I don't have a problem with Christians being involved. I think it is a profession which is going to be it's very hard to stay uncorrupted, but it's not the only profession that it's hard to stay uncorrupted in. And I could say the same thing about church politics. I really despise church politics. I have no desire to get involved with them, but at the same time, church politics are necessary. I mean, somebody has to get together and make the decisions. Whatever the form or structure, you can do better or worse, but it has to happen. Government has to happen, and I think that Christians being involved is important, but I do see Alan's argument that it is very difficult to do so without being corrupted. It is also very difficult to do so and still maintain that ultimate allegiance to the kingdom of God, which is one of the things where, by the way, I fully respect Ted Cruz for, is saying that his allegiance to God is first, because I would have to say the same thing if I was there. And of course, the press typically doesn't have a clue what he's talking about, and makes, you know, a big deal of something that a fair number of Christians would simply have to say amen to. You may disagree with his particular interpretation of Christianity. You may disagree with the way he applies it to politics. But I don't see, as a Christian, I can't possibly disagree with him saying that his allegiance to God comes first. As a matter of fact, out of all the things he said, I strongly respect him for making that as a public statement.
I have to say that having spent 25 years in local politics in the UK, as an elected councillor, I can understand his worries about the requirements of doing politics being a potential corrupting influence. I can see his complaints about knocking campaigns. I mean, I didn't get elected by knocking other persons. I did criticise other people's policies, but personalities were not something that I was interested in. And shady backroom deals were also not something that I felt were at all appropriate. The opportunities were there, but mostly, from my experience, people avoided them. And I was a member of a minority party, were two pretty much equal parties. Everybody had to talk to everybody because there was no overall majority. There were good people in all places. Not that in this country very many people would stand on a validly Christian platform, because our electorate would probably not take that the right way, shall we say. But there have been, for instance, a number of well-known clergymen around this area who have taken interest in local politics, who have stood for election, and obviously everybody has known what their politics are. I have to say that they've always stood for the left-wing parties rather than the right-wing parties, and it is still a matter of complete bafflement how you manage to be Christian and right-wing. But Elgin is doing his best to instruct me in that as we go along.
Well, I think there's also a slight difference between what is right and left here and what is right and left there. You know, I would not feel, in some of the hard right parties here, I would not feel at all comfortable. And I'm not sure I would feel comfortable in your just right-wing parties. There seems to be almost a fundamental difference in the way things are approached there that makes comparison labels a little bit different, or difficult to transcribe. Let me go back a little bit to the point about Christians and the Christian right here. That seems to, I hate to speak for Steve, but it seemed to be where he was going about I don't think Christians on the right here are trying to set up any sort of theocracy or anything along those lines. In fact, quite frankly, I think the reason there's such fear on the left, and maybe this is a little bit of projecting on my side, but and I think there's the reason such push, is because the statistics here are that only 50% of the evangelicals are even registered to vote, and of that, only about 50%, or a total of 25%, do vote. And given the large number of evangelicals in the country, they could pretty much turn any election. And while we have a center-right country that is electing Democrats, if the evangelical vote was to come out and be consistent in the way it's currently voting, which is a big if, there wouldn't have been, for example, in 2012, Romney would have won. And in 2008, McCain would have won. In fact, it would be very difficult for Democrats to actually win elections if the evangelical vote was even 50% larger than it is. So I think that's where some of the angst is, and when there are calls for the evangelicals to become political, which they haven't been in this country since the 1920s. 1920s, they pretty much left politics and have been out of it since then. And there's been a couple of forays back in, but particularly in the 80s for a little bit. I think that's where you're seeing the concern, because up until now, Christians have largely taken the view that they shouldn't be involved.
Yeah, I think that there's a bit of a problem there with terminology and labeling. I'm getting a lot of echoes here, by the way. I'm not sure if I'm echoing through Elgin or through me. So what I'm saying there about the term evangelical is that how many of those evangelicals are actually going to be conservative politically in any case? And the reason is that evangelical has become a positive label in Christianity, and we have a lot of people who are claiming the term evangelical. As a matter of fact, so far as I know, Jim Wallace claims the term evangelical of Sojourners. And he is quite far to the left politically, so I'm not sure just how many of those evangelicals, as you're citing, that you're citing, would actually be right-wing voters. I do think that there are a few people who would like a Christian theocracy, and the reason I think that is that I know some of them. To the extent of having met and talked personally with them, including some who are leaders. And I'm not planning to name names, and the reason for that is that it is a minority. And when I say minority, I don't mean 10-20%. I'm talking about a fairly small percent that is pushing that way, and it's very easy from either side of the spectrum to see the percent who's pushing in a direction as driving the train when they actually aren't. And also saying that, as I believe both Elgin and I could say, that if we were involved in public life, we would want to reflect Christian values in what we did. At least I would hope that we would. And then but that doesn't mean theocracy. And if the next person over thinks that reflecting Christian values means I'm going to rule the country according to my view of the Bible, then the outside observer goes and lumps the people together. And it's one of the problems. I mean, the further you are from somebody, the harder it is to see the gradations. So if you're a pure secularist, it's hard to see the difference between the Christians, and the only answer to that, I think, is that you have to clearly proclaim, here is what we really support. As when we're dealing with Christian values from whichever side, and as I said, being in the center doesn't mean that you don't have biases, and in fact, calling me a centrist is really not that accurate. It's just that my line doesn't pass through the American political parties. I would probably be considered a left-wing for foreign policy, but I would probably be considered quite right-wing on economic policy. The problem being that I don't have any candidates that support my particular combination of values, so I'm always choosing which way that is going to go, and that's a difference. So I can have a problem when I look from capitalistic, from my view of economics. Gradations of socialists are a little harder for me to perceive, you see.
Yes, I have noticed a certain amount of difficulty in perceiving the difference between democratic socialist, fully socialist, Marxist and Stalinist in the States, which are, from my point of view, very different animals, but apparently not in a lot of the USA. I'm particularly interested in this intersection of politics and religion because it was actually convictions towards the gospel that led my politics to move away from those of my parents in my youth. And my parents in my youth were conservative voters. They were instinctive conservative voters. They would have been with the Republican Party and Elgin and possibly you, Henry, at an earlier stage, I suspect. So my standing for election in the first place was motivated by things that came out of faith in any events. I can't see how people of faith can go into politics and not be motivated by those things, but that is not the same thing as Henry says as a theocracy. And were we to see the second coming and Christ returns in the flesh, I am not entirely certain that I would go so far as suggesting that that should be an absolute rule in the old-fashioned sense of things. But that might be a rather rash thing to say. Having said that, I am not, nor have I ever been, an evangelical, so that's foreign territory from my point of view.
Well, this may be one of those differences between America and Europe that you've cited. I mean, and this is nothing new. De Tocqueville described America as a extremely religious country, but that somehow managed within their core, even that far back, to separate the religion from the government. And it wasn't that they didn't want a church, but they wanted to be religious, and they were able to separate out the decisions you would make as a government from the decisions you would make as a Christian. And I think this is where the whole view of limited government comes in. Because if you have a view of limited government and you only want government to deal with the things that it actually has to deal with, and you want to leave everything else to the people, then there's not as much pull to put your religious beliefs into law, because that's just not something government should be doing. So, I think that carries somewhat up into today, and it's one of the things I think is being threatened, in the sense that in the article I posted out on Tuesday on the Ernergion Discussion Network, was the whole concept of religious liberty in the United States is threatened, where the government will decide what you can do and can't do as a person based on laws of commerce that we're all bound into if we actually want to live in the culture. And therefore your religious beliefs are being constrained in that fashion.
I think I'd argue that what they're trying to restrain is prejudice against people on grounds such as race or sexual orientation, in this case sexual orientation. And I would entirely support a lack of any discrimination on the grounds of gender, race, or sexual orientation myself. They're part of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is quite separate from the European Union, and which we signed, I think it was in 1949. These are basic human rights. Where we run into problems is where they intersect with what people see as free exercise of their religious commitments. And there's a whole huge topic there, which we now probably don't have time for today, because I noticed that we're 1 minute past the witching hour. So I think I'll leave it to the two of you if you've got any closing comments, and perhaps we can come back to that item in more depth in, I think it'll be 2 weeks' time, because Elgin, I gather you're not with us next week.
No, I won't. I'll be celebrating my 41st wedding anniversary. So I would just quickly say that this is where I think the problem with large government and religious values comes into clash, because the more and more government, the bigger it becomes, the more area it controls, the more area for conflict, and the less area for freedom. And it's not, to me, it's not, I think the government is not a good reason for that to impinge on your freedom. I should not be in the position of deciding what your religious rights entail in terms of what you think is right or I think is right. You should be the one that determines what your religious beliefs are and what they entail. And I want to allow freedom for the things I disagree with. That's, to me, what part of my article was this week, is that's what tolerance is. Tolerance isn't accepting the things that we already agree with. It's accepting the things we disagree with. That's when we have to be tolerant.
Indeed. And on that note, I think we probably ought to draw this to a close, and I would earnestly urge everybody to join us again next week, but without Elgin, and the week after, when I think Elgin and myself will be delving into that matter in a bit more depth. So have a good weekend and have a good week.